It's good to see all of you guys. How is everybody today? We good? Great. Well, good. Both of you are doing well. It's so good to have y'all here. Just kidding. If you're in the room joining us online, just glad that you're here. Let me just start this way. No matter who you are, no matter where you're from, what generation you're from, it doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter what time and place you lived in history. There are just some things that we all have in common. Isn't that true? When it comes to our human condition, there's just a few things that we all can relate to. And one of these is the fact that we have appetites, right? Appetites. And simply put, it's just really our body's way of telling us when we need or want something. And when it comes to our physical health, this is pretty obvious. We all understand this. It's these little cues that we get. Thankfully, we have an appetite. It tells us, hey, you need to put some nutrients in your body. You need to, eat some food. You need sustenance. You need water. And so that's really what appetites are for. And we all experience that. But we also know that appetites can be really volatile and dangerous when they get out of control, because they can easily get out of control. The reason that they're so dangerous is because, isn't this true? Appetites are never fully and completely satisfied. It's the nature of an appetite. And we all experience this all the time. Just when it relates to food, that one's the obvious one, okay? Because we all have an appetite for food every now and then. You're sitting in church, and I used to experience this big time when I was growing up. I just, going to church, the best part about going to church was dreaming about what lunch was going to taste like. That was my experience, and maybe that's been you. You start getting a little hungry, and things are going a little long, and you start having that craving, and it pops into your mind, I could go for some chips and salsa. You know what I'm saying? Anybody? Chips and salsa, maybe some cheese dip on the side, and that sounds really good. And then you can't stop thinking about it, and your appetite begins to grow until you finally leave and you get out of church and you go to the restaurant in order to, get your fill. And so you start eating those chips and dip, and you eat what you want. As a matter of fact, maybe even a little bit more than you want, and maybe even a little bit more than you actually need. And you're just satisfied you satisfy the hunger, the craving. But then what happens? 3 hours later, you're rummaging through the pantry looking for a snack. Anybody, can you relate to that, or is that just me? Okay, we all understand this, because our appetite was satisfied, but only for a moment. It wasn't satisfied fully or completely. That's just the nature of appetites. And so as you get older, the more you realize that this is true, not just as it relates to food, but as it relates to every category of life. Everything that we do in life is kind of pushed or fueled by an appetite. We have an appetite, a longing. It's why we, have a phone, but we want a new phone. It's why, we have money, but we want more money. We have a house, but we would like a bigger house. We have a car, it works, but we want a new car. We have a job, but we want a better job. And there's just always this sense of longing for something, and then once we have it, we feel like it's been satisfied briefly, but then inevitably we get where we want something again. And here's why, because, I'm telling you, the older you get, the more this is true. It's because nothing in this life fully satisfies. There's no such thing as enough. And our appetites only speak one word: more. Know what I'm saying? That's the language of appetite, is more. I just want more. I want it now, and I don't want to wait. And then once we have more, the cycle continues, because we just want more again. And so the truth is that when it comes to life, there's nothing necessarily wrong with the things that we do want. Isn't that true? There's so much in this life to enjoy and to experience. There's so much about it that I love. And it's so often, for me anyway, it's related to even my feelings and my emotions. And this is what's really interesting about appetites, because even when it comes to those things that aren't tangible, we kind of have this same principle applying. This same kind of desire, this insatiable desire for something more than what we anticipated. And so I grew up in a little town in Georgia. It's called Statesboro, Georgia. I've talked about that before, but I lived there just till I was 13. Okay? So as you know, those were all my formative early childhood years. That's where all of my growing up memories are. You know the ones that I'm talking about. I mean, this is the street that I lived on, that I grew up on. I remembered every nook and cranny. I knew how to turn the corners. I grew up riding, that's where I learned to ride my bike. I rode my bike daily with my friends. We would play different sports, my friends in the neighborhood, because at that time you weren't texting or calling. Like you literally had to drive to somebody's house, to see if they were home and on your bike and go past the dog that would yap and, you were nervous. It was this big, but you thought it was going to bite your pedal off and it just made you really nervous. And we would play wiffle ball or as I would always call it, wiffle ball in my neighbor's front yard. I remember constantly just pestering my dad to go outside when he got home from work every day to throw the football. I loved to do that kind of thing. And I have great memories, but the thing is, when I was 13, we moved. We left. And yet I had these memories, these very fond memories of what it was like to grow up there. I remember the tiniest details of that house that we lived in. Weird details, honestly, things my parents probably don't remember. But it was important to me, and it's a little nostalgic, and I think about those things. But then I moved away, and so all I really had were the memories. You know what I'm talking about? That's all I really had were kind of the feelings and the emotions tied to these memories. I still remember my address and my phone number at that house. Isn't that weird? It's so strange how that works. And yet, as I got older, even as I, got into college in those years, we would travel through Statesboro, and I still had family that was living there, and so we would visit every once in a while. And every time, what I wanted to do was to go by my old house. Does anybody have this experience? Some of you is like, no, I've lived in the same house for 79 years. It's great. For me, there was just something, so you don't fully understand this, but for me, there's just something about going back, and I always longed to do that. I just wanted to walk down the street and see, the little cuts in the asphalt where I remember a motorcycle wreck taking place out in front of our house, and the handlebars had dug into the asphalt. Like I remembered that being there, and sure enough, I would walk and I would see that, and then I would stand in front of the house, and here's what happened 100% of the time. When I would actually experience it, it always left me a little bit disappointed. It wasn't quite what I remembered it to be. The house was a little bit smaller. It wasn't quite as amazing. The yard wasn't quite as fun. They had cut down some trees, and it just wasn't what I had anticipated. And this is true in all kinds of areas of our lives because this is what we know is true. So often, the experience itself is often less satisfying than our anticipation of it. Isn't that true? We've all experienced this. Come on now. Like we long for things. We cannot wait for holidays and vacations, and it's going to be so much fun. And this year, I'm going to hunker down. I'm going to experience this, and I'm going to really feel it. And then, I can't wait for it to happen. And we plan and prepare, and we're anticipating, and we're excited. And even as adults, like this is kind of, and yet Christmas rolls around, or we finally go on that much anticipated dream vacation, and what happens? Almost 100% of the time, it leaves us just a little short. It's not quite what we anticipated. It's great. It's a fun experience, but it's not quite as satisfying as just the anticipation of thinking about it. And that's the nature of an appetite when it comes to those things, even with our feelings and emotions. We long for something, and yet it doesn't fully satisfy once we have that. We long for the next thing. And does it mean that those things aren't things we should pursue or long for or want? Well, absolutely not. There's so many things in this life that are worth pursuing. There's so many things that are enjoyable and fun. I mean, it may be as simple for some of you as just finishing a good book. Or it may be as extravagant as, climbing to the top of Mount Everest, and everywhere in between. It may be listening to your favorite music. It may be traveling around the world, maybe sailing around the world. winning the lottery, getting 1 million subscribers on your YouTube channel. It may be just sitting in a boat at sunset with your family and just enjoying that moment. There's so many things to experience and so many things to enjoy. And yet, the older you get, you learn, we all learn, that they all fall a little short. The memory of them, great. But the actual experience itself, it's not completely and fully satisfying. I think that this is actually the picture that Jesus is painting in his story of the prodigal son. This is the story we've been looking at for the last couple of weeks. We're going to wrap this up today. But I think it's this very idea that's kind of being threaded through this story. We just kind of miss it sometimes. But I think this is what's here, that really kind of this underlying appetite and urge within all of us is what Jesus is kind of pointing to. And I'll tell you why in just a second. But this story, we've said that, it's called, we know it, we're familiar with it, the parable of the prodigal son, the story of the prodigal son, but we've said that maybe it's better suited to be called story of two sons or the story of two brothers. Because we know that at the beginning of Luke chapter 15, Jesus has an audience of people around him, and it's full of at least a couple of different kind of people that Luke identifies. There's these sinners and tax collectors. You've got the sinners, kind of the very wrongdoing, rule breaker type of people. But then you've also got, on the other hand, these Pharisees. You've got the religious people, the rule followers. They just are kind of doing it right. You've got those types of people in this crowd. And Jesus seems to be addressing not just one, but both of them. And yet this argument ensues because he knows that the Pharisees are looking at what he's doing and the time that he spends with, people who aren't quite like him and don't live like him and don't think like him. And he knows that, he senses that. And they're constantly looking at Jesus and accusing him of spending time with them. They're saying, this man welcomes sinners. And he even eats with them. I mean, it's that bad. And here's why this was such a big deal. Like, to us, it's kind of like, I do that all the time. I are one, I eat with myself all the time. But in ancient Middle Eastern culture, for certain, what this meant, you see, was to share a meal together really just meant that you accepted them. You have received them. It was that important. To share a meal together was a sign, a symbol of acceptance and wanting to actually be with them. And they couldn't understand it. It just broke their paradigms. And so they were angry about it. And they would accuse Jesus that this is wrong and you shouldn't do this. We don't understand why you didn't. Of course, Jesus picks up on it and he knows this. And so he decides to tell these stories in order to teach. This is what he often did. He would tell these parables in order to teach something. So he tells these 3 stories, and they all have some things in common. In each of the stories, there's something that is lost, right? At the beginning, he talks about a shepherd who has lost one of his sheep. And so the shepherd goes in order to find the sheep until he finds it, and then he brings it back home. And then there's a woman. He talks at the next story. There's a woman, and she's lost one of her coins, and it's like basically her value. It's her day's wage. It's very important. It's valuable to her. And so she turns the house upside down until she finds this coin. But then Jesus tells a third story. And here's one of the things that actually is uniquely different. It's in contrast to the other two. Listen to this. Isn't it true that when it comes to this lost son, nobody goes looking for him? Jesus tells these stories, and the shepherd goes to look for the sheep. The woman looks for the coin. But nobody goes out to look for the lost son in the story. There's just something unique about that. Of course, we're thinking, okay, so who should have? Who should have been the one to do that? It was certainly not me. Was it them? I think it's probably you. That's not my department. I don't have to do that, do you? I don't go on Tuesday nights. I don't do visitation. I'm awkward about that. That's not my job, is it? And yet, to the audience that Jesus was speaking to, they knew exactly the answer to that question. They knew who needed to go out, and it was the older brother. It was his responsibility. It was the older brother's responsibility to really be kind of the caretaker of the family, to take the interest of the family and put them first, to say, I'm going to make sure that the family stays together, that things stay unified. And so it would have been his responsibility in their minds that he should have been the one to go do that. He should have come to his father and said, Dad, we've lost, your son, my brother. I'm gonna leave. I'm gonna go look for him. I'm gonna go find him. And I know it's gonna be a difficult task and it's gonna cost me a lot, but I'm willing to do that because that's my responsibility. And yet, his audience knowing this, Jesus doesn't tell the story that way, which might have caught them, I think, probably a little off guard. It's like might have surprised them a little bit. It's like, oh, well, that's not what we were expecting. I mean, the older brother really just stayed home with his dad, and that was kind of his responsibility. But after all, it didn't bother him too much because, who would go after him? They really kind of understood it themselves. Jesus painted such a dreary picture of this younger brother. Why would anybody go search for him? He wasn't worth it. And yet, Jesus continues the story, and the younger brother finally kind of comes to his senses. He takes his part of the inheritance, and he goes and he squanders it. He wastes it. He plays. He does what he wants. He lives like he wants. But then he comes home, and his father receives him. And it's so interesting because the picture that Jesus paints here is this older son who's really angry about what his dad has done. He's just bothered by it because he doesn't want, everything to kind of fall back into his younger brother's hands. It's like, why? He should be punished. You don't need to hang out with him. You need to tell him what his sins are and remind him of that and let him know his consequences and what it's going to take to kind of earn his way back. And yet he doesn't do that. And it bothers his listeners, but it certainly bothered this older brother in the story. And he even threw a party. Come on. There was a feast in order to celebrate, but the older son was angry. He was mad, and so he didn't go in. He stood outside. And this is kind of where we left off last week, because then the dad goes out, and Luke records that Jesus said he pleads with his older son, something he didn't have to do. He pleads with his older son. And then he says, my son, you're always with me. You're always with me. Everything I have is yours. Talk about what that means in just a second. But, and this is where we ended last week, he continues, and this is what's so subtle, but so profound, important, I think. But we had to celebrate and be glad. We had to celebrate. Here's why that's interesting. Because each of the three stories, another thing they have in common is that they all end with a celebration. The shepherd finds a sheep. He invites his friends to celebrate that he has found his lost sheep and it's been returned. The woman calls her friends over, invites them to the house. They celebrate because she has found this lost coin. I mean, Jesus makes a point to add that into the story, and this one is no different. There is this celebration, and each time, his audience would have put two and two together. They knew that any celebration meant food and drinking. There's a party. If you're inviting people over to your house to celebrate something, you're having a feast. Kill the fattened calf. We're about to celebrate. We're about to have a full-on throwdown. Let's have a party. And that's so significant. It's so significant because for them, this feast not only meant acceptance for those who were there, but it meant a celebration of ultimate satisfaction. Greatest day in that father's life would have been this moment when his son returned. He was lost, but now he's found. He said he was dead, but now he's alive. And so let's celebrate. Let's get excited about this. This is a big deal. Biggest day in my life, and yet you're not in here celebrating with me. You clearly don't understand what a big deal this is for me. And he says, because this is why we're celebrating, because this brother of yours, not this son of mine, this brother of yours, he was dead and he's alive again. He was lost and is found. And this is where Jesus ends the story. Now, what's interesting about that is Jesus leaves it with this tension. He creates this tension. And so this younger son who has come back, from the dead and has been invited back into the family full on and given everything, he's there and he's with his dad. He's in the presence of the Father in this feast. And yet Jesus ends the story with the older son standing outside. And he stood outside because he was mad. Well, why was he mad though? Like, what was he really upset with? What was so upsetting to him that caused him to not want to come in and celebrate? Well, I think it was because he was considering the cost. And not just the cost for his father, but his cost, his loss. Here's why that's such a big deal. Because, see, when the younger son left and took his part of the inheritance, at that moment, everything that was left in his father's care, everything that his father owned that was left, was essentially now the older son's. It was his. It was all his, everything. And so in a very real sense, every single robe, every single ring, every fattened calf, every possession of the father's was now really under the control of and in possession of this older son. It was all his. And so when he hears about this younger son, his brother coming back, who's, done his own thing, and now his father has put a robe on him and put a ring on his finger and now has thrown this massive feast and party for his brother, he recognizes what he has begun to lose. And he's mad about it. You see, here's what we have to understand at this point in the story. The only way the father can restore his youngest son is at great expense to his oldest son. Do we understand that? That there was a massive cost involved. And the thing is we simply pay attention. I mean, when we read this story, let's be honest, we love to really pay attention to the unbelievable grace of the father as he receives his prodigal child back into the fold, and everything is free, and he just gives it back to him, and he restores him to a full position as a son, as an heir in that family, and it's wonderful, it's unending grace, and that's kind of where we leave it. But the truth is, yes, it was free for the younger son, but it was a massive expense. It was incredibly costly for the older son. There was a huge cost involved. It was extremely expensive. This wasn't, you see, we all know this is true. When it comes to freedom, freedom isn't free, at least not for everybody. We know this. Somebody always has to pay the price for freedom. Isn't that true? Somebody pays the price for freedom. And it's a wonderful story until you consider that. It's like, well, how much like the older brother are we exactly? It's one thing to invite somebody back in that, and it's kind of no skin, off of your back. It doesn't bother you all that much. It's, sure, we'll let you back in. You can be a part of this. Sure, we'll go to you. Sure, but if it was really giving up, as much as this older brother was being forced to give up, not choosing it, but being forced to, well, maybe we wouldn't respond too much differently. I mean, this is kind of like we are, isn't it? And I think what we could really point to here, and the reason that this older brother was so angry is because at the end of the day, they were really kind of after the same thing, don't you think? I mean, Jesus paints this picture, and we've got the younger brother, but we've got an older brother, and they seem just so at odds, so completely different. But the truth is, what's similar is that both brothers were looking for the very same thing. And I don't know that they could have put their finger on it necessarily. But they were both looking for the same thing, but they went about it in very different ways. The younger brother, what did he do? He left home and made all kinds of wrong decisions in order to find what he was looking for. The older brother stayed home and did all kinds of right things, but for the wrong reasons in order to find what he was looking for. So what was it? I mean, what was it they were really looking for? I mean, if we're being honest, I think we all can relate to this. Honestly, it's clear Jesus was describing that they both wanted what their father had, but they didn't want their father. We said that a week or two ago. They wanted what their father had. Well, what did he have? He had wealth. He had power. He had an incredible reputation. He had influence, and they wanted those things. Why? I mean, there's nothing wrong with those things, right? I mean, inherently, there's nothing wrong with those things. But in their minds, those were really the keys to a successful life. I mean, those were the keys that would unlock the door to, being happy and content and kind of being in control of things and getting the things that we really desire the most in order to sort of satisfy that appetite. That's what we assume. And we understand this. It's like those aren't necessarily wrong things. The problem is that somehow, even as we get older, there's just something in us, isn't this true? There's just something in us that has trouble really figuring out that those things don't fully and completely satisfy us. And they always fall a little short. They disappoint at the end of the day. We get more and then we want more. And because we get more and so we buy more and we get in more debt and so we just need more in order to, pay the debt so that we can then get more. I mean, it's just, that's how our appetites work, and we all get this, and that's just that. They both wanted the same thing. They want what you and I want. But I think at the end of the day, what I think most people learn at the end of their life, but man, if we could understand it and grasp it at the beginning of our lives, things would look so different. But the truth is this: there is no one, no thing, and no experience that will ever come close to fully and completely satisfying you. How is it that we've not learned that? How is it that, it takes our entire life, it takes accumulating and getting all kinds of things only to realize that at the end of the day, the grass really isn't greener on the other side. It really didn't fully and completely satisfy us. It didn't make us as happy as we thought it would. And it has left us wanting more. There must be something else. And so the question I think we need to consider, let me just ask you to really think about this. What is it that you really are hoping will satisfy your greatest longings? I mean, what are you kind of leaning on? Does it sound similar to maybe what these brothers were really searching for? Is it some of those things? Because those aren't necessarily, those are great things. They're all great things. It is enjoyable. We want quality relationships with people. We want to be happy and content. We want to enjoy our job and enjoy life, and we want to be healthy. And those aren't bad things to want, as long as we understand that they won't fully satisfy. But if you're leaning into those things and you feel like that's just going to do it, I'm really banking on those things satisfying my greatest longings, you will be left disappointed. Every single person who has ever lived has experienced this. I think this is why it's so important to see what happens at the end of this story. See, it's no coincidence that Jesus ends the story with this celebration. Each of the stories, but certainly this last one. It's no coincidence. He ends the story with a feast. And not just any feast. What Jesus is pointing to here, it's clear, is the ultimate feast. Something that this life actually can't offer, that we only catch a glimpse of, that we only experience to a small degree. There's the longing for it, the anticipation of it, but the full experience of it is something we can't fully grasp yet. But here at the feast, what Jesus is showing is that this is where the younger brother finally found what he was looking for. It was in his father's presence, celebrating with the Father, where he experienced everything that you and I want: belonging and acceptance and peace, contentment, joy, freedom. That's what was experienced, but it was this feast that the Father invited his son into, but then he went out and he invited the older son as well. But the older son stood outside and he refused to go in. And he didn't do he had already not fulfilled one of his responsibilities as the eldest son, but now he wasn't going in to celebrate either. And that's the picture that Jesus paints, because he hasn't figured it out yet. And so in the story, there's not a good older brother. It's a bad one. Like, he's a terrible example of what an older brother should look like. But I think, what if Jesus is pointing to this true older brother that points to our true home? You see, the feast is really kind of that true home where we really do find that sense of belonging and acceptance. It's the place where you will be fully and completely satisfied. And it's not necessarily in this life. We catch pieces of it, glimpses of it, but not until then. That's our true home. But the only way we get here is with a true older brother. A true older brother. You see, the question is, if that's true, how do we get back home? How do we get back home? We need a true older brother. We need an older brother who is willing to go to the greatest lengths, climb the highest mountains in order to rescue that which is lost. I think that's the picture that Jesus is painting. And here, these Pharisees, I think what made Jesus so upset is, here these Pharisees, teachers of the law, these leaders in Israel, they had been given the opportunity, multiple opportunities for literally centuries, to be that for the people of Israel, to be a true older brother, to teach and to correct and to love and to care for. And yet they didn't. They used it for themselves. They didn't want to sacrifice their own desires and their own reputation and perhaps their own pocketbook by giving it away, by caring for those sinners and tax collectors, kind of the filth of the earth. And yet this story really points to our true older brother, the one that we really need. Because see, the truth is, the story didn't have a true older brother, but we do. That's the advantage that you and I have now. We have a true older brother, the one who left heaven, traveled great distances in order to come to this earth and spend time on this earth. And then he even earned, while he was here, everything that belonged to his Father. I mean, by the end of his life, this is what we see happening. I mean, he loved people and he loved God with everything that he had. And so by the end of his life, he has earned everything. Everything is deserved by him. And so we see that, Jesus, this true older brother, has earned this royal robe by the end of his life. And yet, instead, he's given nothing, and he's stripped naked. And he's earned a ring on his finger, and yet, instead, he received a crown of thorns on his head. And he deserved a fattened calf, and yet he was given sour wine instead. And then he made the ultimate sacrifice willingly. He chose to pursue you and me. He pursued us. He came after us, and Jesus became and is our true older brother. And here's what's so amazing about this, is because this older brother isn't waiting on you to pursue him. He's not waiting on you to come after him. Matter of fact, without his pursuit, we can't wake up to him. He has to come toward us in our direction. And then we have an opportunity to say yes to our older brother. Yes, I would love to join you in this feast. And not only does this true older brother attend the feast, he sets the table. And he is inviting you and me to come back home. He's inviting us to come back home, to come experience the feast, to come and be fully satisfied, completely satisfied, to receive the things that we couldn't see otherwise. It's like the best version of everything you could possibly experience in this life becomes fully and completely satisfying at this feast, in the presence of your Heavenly Father. You see, I think that's why when the Pharisees, were accusing Jesus, like, you're hanging out with these people, this riffraff, these people don't think like you. Why are you doing that? Why aren't you condemning them? Why aren't you telling them what they're doing wrong and, tell them to get on the straight and narrow? Why aren't you doing that? I think he got so upset with them because they didn't understand that they had the opportunity to be an older brother to the people of Israel, and they weren't. They forfeited that opportunity. And I think he was saying to them, and if you're not careful, you're going to be invited, because you are invited to this feast, but you're going to be left standing outside, because he ends this story there with this drastic picture of the older brother standing outside the feast and not coming in. Who knows how the story might have actually ended, but that's the way Jesus leaves it, with this tension. And so I want to end this series maybe a little bit differently than I normally would. And so I wrote something down, and I just want to read you what I wrote. And basically it's my version of what I think Jesus was communicating to the people who were listening to him in Luke 15. Like, this is just kind of in my words. That I'm not suggesting this is, all completely accurate, and just bear with me. These are just my words of what I feel like he's wanting to say to you and me today. When they said, why would you hang out with those people? Why would you spend time with them? We just don't understand. I think Jesus might could have said something like this. Wait a minute, guys. Do you really have a problem with me eating with sinners? Really? Clearly you have no idea what you're talking about, because the truth is, it's actually way worse than that. Way worse than you can imagine. Let me explain what I mean. See, I don't just go eat with sinners. I receive them and accept them right where they are. And I actually don't mind at all leaving behind the vast majority of people who are already safe, or at least they think they're safe. The people who honestly look a lot like me. I don't mind leaving them where they are, heading into the hills and the caves, looking for the ones who are lost. I don't mind going into difficult places, even dangerous places you would never expect me to be. After all, I'm not just going to sit inside my church building or my Sunday school classroom thinking that, hey, they'll just show up one day. And I'm certainly not just going to write a check or donate some things, I didn't even want anyway. Instead, here's what I do. I'm willing to go outside the walls of what is comfortable to me in order to search for them, to look for them, even if they're not looking for me. And as you can imagine, they're definitely not expecting me to show up, to be there, to actually go where they are. And that's because they've never known a true older brother before. So they just assume that I'm going to do what everybody else has always done, that I'm going to judge them, that I'm not really going to love and care for them. They just assume that I really don't want to be with them because they're different than I am, because they live differently. They talk differently. They don't dress like me. They don't value what I value. They don't believe what I believe. So of course, how could I really care about them? I couldn't possibly want to be with them. But this is what makes me different. Because the truth is actually just the opposite. You see, instead of judging them and being turned off by them, instead of being angry with them, I'm actually filled with compassion, like a father toward his lost son. And so when I see them, I don't just wait on them to come to me. I take off running down the road with no regard for my own reputation, and right there in front of everybody, for everybody to see, and I wrap my arms around those unruly, ungodly people, and I shower them with kisses. And man, I love how that always surprises them, catches them off guard, but I don't stop there. I don't just spend a few minutes with them and, put a robe on their back and put a ring on their finger. I give them what they don't deserve. I adopt them as my own. I restore them. I give them a new purpose, a new life, the kind of life that fully and completely satisfies what they've longed for the most. And then, I invite them into the ultimate feast. We celebrate. We eat together. The ultimate symbol of full acceptance. We sit down around a table together with the rest of our family and we break bread together. And you wonder, does this cost me anything? The answer is yes, absolutely. In fact, it cost me everything. So you're probably wondering if it's really worth it then. Why in the world do I make such a big deal out of all this? Why do I care about them so much? But let me ask you, isn't that what you do when you've lost something that's extremely valuable to you? Aren't you willing to pay whatever the price and do whatever it takes to find it again? See, that's why I'm inviting you to celebrate with me, to join me at the feast. Because what was lost is now found. What was dead has been made alive. Because my child has come back home. And I'm inviting you to do the same. I'm wanting to know, are you ready to come back home? Would you bow your heads? I wonder if there are some people watching or listening online, maybe here in the room with us today, who would say, yes, I'm ready to come back home. Because the invitation is there. And it's free, at least for you and me. But it wasn't free to your true older brother, Jesus. And yet, he invites you into this celebration, into this ultimate feast, to be with the Father. And only then can we begin to experience full and complete satisfaction, happiness, contentment, joy, fulfillment, freedom in the presence of a heavenly Father who loves you. If you're ready to receive that today, I want to invite you to pray with me. A prayer does not fix you. A prayer does not save you. Only Jesus can do that. A prayer is simply a declaration of what is true in your heart. So you can pray something like this with me. Heavenly Father, thank you for sending Jesus, for making a way, because I've lost my way. I can't do this on my own. I know that now. And I'm one of those sinners. But sometimes I'm one of those Pharisees. And the truth is, I want the same thing that they want. But I know now that that only comes in your presence. And so I receive the gift of salvation. It's a free gift to me, but it cost you everything. And I thank you for that. So in return, I give you my life. I give you my all. Would you be my Lord and my Savior? In Jesus' name, amen.